Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? First, I'd like to acknowledge the Port Authority. I'm not a native New Yorker, but I've lived here the overwhelming majority of my life. And whenever visitors would come to see me, or I'd go to other places, they talk about Times Square, they talk about the vibrant nature of New York, they talk about the transportation system, but they would say, what about your airport? They really were surprised in terms of what they experienced when they went through the airports. So what you saw here from the Port Authority in terms of making them world class, for 2 years I lived in Vancouver, and if you've ever seen that airport, it's extremely well done, and it's with all materials and supplies and homegrown from British Columbia. And it makes a lasting impression on people. And my hat's off to the Port Authority and Rick, because they made a tremendous investment, and return on that investment we'll all realize. I'm going to start off with a little bit of a preamble, and I'm going to ask the panelists, Marie-Therese Dominguez from New York State DOT Commissioner, Jay Nider from MBTA Director of Capital Projects, and Andrew Kimball from New York City Economic Development Corporation. Every year I'm a member of the Building Congress, and the Building Congress is made up of firms that actually reside in New York, but they have a footprint bigger than New York. And every year we make a lobbying trip down to Washington to talk about infrastructure. And for the 5-6 years, actually longer than that I've been doing that, it's been a kind of invigorating experience up to a certain point, because infrastructure was a bipartisan initiative that both sides of the aisle understood the importance of it. You have to make investment in infrastructure, not only to build and expand upon it, but also to maintain a state of good repair. It's not a secret that the global leaders in the world make investments in infrastructure. And there was a period of time where, I remember the first year of the Trump administration went down, and people said there will be an infrastructure bill this year. The second didn't quite get there. Second year, they said we're reasonably sure it's going to be this year. And I'm not picking on administrations. I'm not picking on party politics. It's the issue of the importance of that infrastructure and the commitment that we have to make as a nation to be able to fund it and expand it. The economy is dependent upon it. So the first question I'm going to ask each one of the panelists, and I'd like them to answer, is, for the first 60 to 70 years of the 20th century, the United States was in an expansive mode. It funded infrastructure, it built transportation, it built development. The intrinsic relationship between development, infrastructure, and transportation is known to everybody in the room. But while now, as we rolled into the 21st century, we haven't been able to keep that mojo, that momentum, that focus on infrastructure. And it's been a challenge, I think, for the people that run agencies like the panelists do. So I'd like to ask them from a standpoint of, how are you dealing with that? What do you see in terms of a change in approach that you may have in terms of being able to do the work you do, which is critical? So I'll start with you, Marie-Therese.
Good morning. Thanks, Tom. It's great to be with you all this morning. It's a good question because I think, for those of us that have been in transportation for a good long time, we've certainly seen a lot of change in the industry, for better, for worse, but also kind of the level of investment across the board. So I have to say, I started in transportation right out of law school. I had the opportunity to go to work for the United States Department of Transportation. And it was a really unique time. It was right after the first ICE bill had been passed. The first surface transportation bill, with a remarkable senator from New York, a guy named Moynihan, had really transformed the way highway and transit funding were being looked at. And instead of separate funding streams and looking at everything the way that we had done over the course of the middle of the century, everything was new and different. We had new funding programs, we had new grant opportunities, and implementing all of that was terribly exciting. But every time we went for reauthorization, it was a struggle, because what we were seeing, as we all know, time and again, the funding sources were drying up. And so to me, fundamentally, the question is always, how are you going to pay for it? And we've seen an evolution of that until this last bill. I would have told you coming out of the previous administration, I'm not quite sure what we're going to see in terms of continued investment. What I was very heartened by was the level of funding that New York State was putting in to transportation, recognizing what an incredible economic driver transportation is in all of its modes, in all of its forms, airports, transit, surface, bridges. We saw a lot of innovation in the state of New York. And that to me was always exciting. And we've seen that continue. Now we've got the federal IIJA. We're matching that specifically with a record level of investment from the state. And we've got a great path forward, certainly for New York State DOT with a $32.8 billion 5-year capital plan. It's the level of consistent funding that we need to see, not only for the industry, but specifically for New Yorkers, to make sure that we've got a clear path forward in the level of our investment. And I think, to me, that level of continued advocacy, but also showing in demonstrable ways, you're going to see, are these investments actually paying off? So then it becomes more incumbent upon the industry and all of us to make sure that we're delivering and demonstrating. And just like Rick was talking about in his presentation here, the number of jobs that are created are extraordinary, and telling the story becomes more important. And because we need that next level of investment. We always have to be going for it. So even though we've just gotten it, the story starts again to start to lay the groundwork for the next level, because it comes around sooner than you think. So,
Jay?
Good morning, everyone. That was great, thank you. It's hard to follow. I guess I look back at my career a little bit, and when I first came out of college, I was the first engineer hired at the transportation agency in 15 years. And transportation has been very cyclical, right? You get funding, and then it kind of dies down, and then you get another wave of funding. And I think we're in an evolutionary time now. I mean, with the Biden administration funding transportation with the current bill, I think it really creates opportunities. I was fortunate to, when I joined MBTA in Boston, our Governor Baker, has been a huge proponent of transportation and transit, and we had a sizable funded program from the state. And so with that, now we can add on top of that the additional federal funding, which we sorely need. It's always funding that slows things down. I don't think it's the project development process. We've been working at that for years. I think we got that figured out in most cases, but the funding is the one thing. I think Rick Cotton, kind of laid it out very well with the airports here earlier. It's taken a long time to get these agreements in place to move forward with the 3 major airports here in New York City. So I think funding is there. I think taking advantage of it and showing the public, that we can put projects in place and complete them in a timely manner is where the proof is in the pudding.
Thank you, Jay. Andrew?
Great. Well, it's great to be here. I'm honored to be on a stage with such transportation expertise. My sense is you wake up thinking about transportation, you go to bed thinking about transportation, you may also dream about it. For me, it's about economic development and jobs. So obviously there is a close intertwining between transportation and economic development. And in my career in the last 30 years, there's never been a moment where there's been this kind of federal dollars available that touches both transportation and economic development. And obviously the infrastructure bill is extraordinary in that regard. There's also the Inflation Reduction Act. There's leftover dollars from COVID relief. It is a very, very unique moment. I'd say there's also a very unique moment in that you have an alignment between a mayor and a governor that we haven't seen in my lifetime either. And the result of those things for us on the ground, where we focus on community redevelopment, we focus on supply chain, we focus on key sectors, we focus on workforce development leading into those sectors. It's a very unique moment where you can tackle a project like the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center, an intermodal facility, where because of city, state, federal, and private dollars, we're going to have the opportunity to redevelop the food distribution center there, where 25% of everything we eat goes through there. But it's a decrepit facility. It's really an environmental justice travesty with 1,000 trucks idling on fossil fuel generators all day. Because of the Infrastructure Act, because of partnership with the state, we have an opportunity now to rebuild that facility.
I think it's Rahm Emanuel said that crisis is a terrible thing to waste, but I'm going to take a derivative of that, and that's, infrastructure funding is the terrible thing to waste. When I entered the public sector, I entered probably more as from a private sector mentality that a dollar you don't spend today will be a dollar you can make an investment on tomorrow, and there's nothing wrong with having a savings account. However, when you get money given to you by either state and local governments or by the federal government, you don't use it, you lose it. So this is record funding with IIJA. This is something that a lot of us that have been in the industry for a long time have dreamed about, and it's here. And now we have to seize the moment. So, what are you doing at the MBTA to focus on that, Jay, in terms of trying to take advantage of those leverage dollars that you need to bring to the table to couple up with the IIJA funding and the processes you have to go through to be able to get that? Because I think that's a shared need that a number of people here have in terms of how to best go about doing that.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think one of the things that we've been working very hard with the legislature is to get bond funding for the match, right? You get federal funding. If you don't have the match, it's, you don't have an opportunity to move things forward. And we were fortunate for Governor Baker to pass a major bond bill for the match of any federal funding that comes into the state. So I think that's one key part. And I think the second part, and looking as the bill actually progressed through the legislature, it looks like there was going to be a lot of competitive grants that came out of your formula funds were going to increase, but a large share of the additional funding was going to be competitive nationally. So we went on a hiring spree, and we hired at least 5, I think, grant writers in our group. And then we actually supplemented that with a couple of consultants nationally that had expertise in writing grants for state agencies across the country or federal agencies, as well as departments of transportation. And on average, we did about $20 million or won about $20 million worth of grants annually. In the last 6 months, we're close to almost $200 million. So that is a huge supplement to our program, plugs right into our CIP, and I think that's going to be part of the equation for the next 5 years.
How has it impacted the way we operate? I mean, we have a fantastic grants writing team. I think I'm the first EDC president in a while that's spent as much direct time with them as they've experienced, and absolutely critical. I should also say, at the city hall level, it is very important that we're coordinated. And Deputy Mayor Mira Joshi manages a group that does research on federal grants out of City Hall. So each agency comes to the table with ideas, certainly on bigger projects like Hunts Point, where we received a $110 million grant. That's got to be very, very closely coordinated and calibrated with other asks that the city has of the federal government and the state. There's smaller grants, though, that are absolutely critical to what we do every day. So a couple of examples there. We just received through IIJA a $7 million greenways planning grant. So again, transportation, how do you move people around city? People are riding bikes more than ever. How do we rationalize our bike lane network in the city? Second one is around micromobility and freight transportation. So we received a grant in the $5 million range to develop 5 different locations where you can bring in goods by barge, offload them onto micro containers that go on the back of electric vehicles or electric bikes for delivery. In the context of work going on the BQE, congestion pricing, that kind of efficiency in terms of delivery is absolutely critical to economic development.
Rudy Therese, Andrew mentioned the project, Hunts Point, Sheridan Expressway Boulevard, but that's a tremendous project that the state did in terms of improving transportation needs in the area, separation of the truck traffic from the neighborhood and the environmental impacts that it caused. And if you want to expound upon that or give other examples where you're making investments coupling with other state agencies or local entities to be able to get the biggest bang for the buck.
So the Hunts Point project is still ongoing. We just completed phase one and are well into phase two. But to your point, these are all projects that fundamentally address reconnecting communities. And Governor Hochul has been extremely focused on this. One of the things that she outlined, and you talked about before the previous question, how are you spending your dollars? Well, about 40% of our 5-year capital plan dollars are really reflect that federal level of investment, right? So the IIJA dollars are going in there. We've got about $3 billion worth of projects that are just focused on reconnecting communities. And when you look at the state, if you start here in New York City and you focus on Hunts Point, it's building off the work that we did on the Sheridan, taking an interstate into a signalized boulevard and literally building the connectors from the neighborhoods in the Bronx across the Sheridan, providing access directly to the Bronx River, creating additional new green space, expanding Starlight Park, et cetera. And we've taken that work, and now with the 3 phases of Hunts Point, $1.7 billion in total, looking at taking those trucks off the roads. As my colleague here, Mr. Kimball, was explaining, Hunts Point provides over 60% of the Northeast with food, let alone New York City, the incredible role it plays. But those trucks, like water, find their own level. And without providing a direct access point and creating those literally bridges, ramps, et cetera, for the trucks to get directly to the Hunts Point in the most efficient way, taking them off the roads, cleaning the air in the sense that we have less idling and less truck traffic, to an area, a neighborhood that traditionally has seen incredible asthma rates. It's a step in the right direction. At the same time, we've extended all of that green space. We're creating more and more bridges literally across the community in the Bronx. And now you see MTA with the additional stations that we're building up there. It is literally the revitalization of the Bronx that I think is happening. That's starting here. So that's ongoing here in terms of reconnecting in New York City. You take that, you expand that to Albany. We're redoing the Livingston Avenue Bridge connecting Albany and Rensselaer with a new track that will help improve passenger service on Amtrak all the way upstate. It's single tracked right now. It's literally a Civil War era bridge. And we will create bike and pedestrian access across the Hudson there as well. So expanding that and reconnecting. Then you take that and extrapolate it to Syracuse, and we've got I-81, where we're fundamentally changing the community in positively. This is all built on community input over the course of over a decade. The community is saying to us, we want to take down this infrastructure, this viaduct that was literally loomed over the city for decades, taking it down, creating a community grid, providing direct access for all members of the community, and fundamentally righting some wrongs that have occurred through some bad planning over the years, and then extending that one more all the way further west to Buffalo with the Kensington project, which again is reconnecting a community, reconnecting an infrastructure that had been, an Olmsted Parkway that had been destroyed in the name of high-speed access to the suburbs. And we're looking to cover the Kensington and provide that level of connectivity again inside neighborhoods that are desperately looking for it. So great opportunities across the board.
And when I was in grammar school, the interstate system was being built. You have basically you go year to year and you have your same classmates. And I remember one year coming back in September, and a girl that had been through 5 different grades with me wasn't there. And she wasn't there because they built an expressway, and she ended up going to another school because it was too difficult for her to come across. So the social impacts are real. They really are. So, Jay, you know, for those of you that don't know, a little bit of trivia, the first subway system built, the first subway tunnel built in the United States was not New York, it was Boston. But, you know, he's responsible for capital programs at a legacy system that's been around excess of 100 years. So the infrastructure funding that comes his way and comes legacy systems way has to be able to accommodate state of good repair needs, making sure that you're extending the life of the useful asset, as well as needs to be able to cater to expansions of that system to be able to serve the needs of the community and also address some of the social issues and development issues. So how do you navigate those waters in terms of the money that you have and making the decisions with respect to where you make those funding priority decisions?
Well, we have a pretty robust CIP development process where we look at all elements of our system, all modes, all infrastructure, whether it's buildings, it's stations, it's tracks, signal, power. And, you know, we put that all in a bucket, and we also look at accessibility. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that we deal with is accessibility on a legacy system. And I think that's one of the main drivers to try to make our transit system accessible to everyone. And so that's one of our first priorities. It's accessibility and safety are our two key drivers. So you weigh that on every single project that comes in the door. Everybody in the organization has a chance to put in a request for funding for a particular project. We get 200 to 300 every year. We whittle that down, looking at the metrics of accessibility and safety, and then also state of good repair. So I think it's a tiered approach. And it seems to always come out that, you know, we get it down to a navigatable number of projects that fit within the funding that we have available for that fiscal year. And I think the other piece, you know, if we don't have funding available in that fiscal year or the next or over our 5-year CIP, I like to bring in a little bit on the economic side. A lot of organizations kind of look at development as, you know, not favorable, right? I look at it in a much different fashion. We have ramped up our transit-oriented development group, TOD, to go out and work with developers if they're building close or in proximity to one of our facilities or adding a major housing development for low-income housing or something like that. And we work with them on how can their development enhance what we're doing and complement what we're doing. In a lot of cases, we get a significant amount of revenue from our private sector folks to actually improve stations, head houses, and accessibility. So I think that's another way. We average between $50 and $100 million a year from the private sector on the TOD side, where you're building in and around or over the top of. We own the air rights, so we negotiate air rights use from the private developer side. So I think that's another way we can inject additional capital into our program to achieve what we need to.
You know, if you go back and take a look at the pictures of the construction of the Queens Boulevard line going out into Queens, and the 8th Avenue subway line going west to Central Park. At the original construction, there was no development. I think the Dakota was there. That building was there. You'll see pictures. But you don't see the dense development you see along the Queens Boulevard line like you see today. So that an intrinsic relationship between development and transportation is one that's existed forever. And there's new challenges because this city constantly reinvents itself and makes those kind of investments. And I'm sure that's one of the challenges you have, Andrew, in terms of making sure that the two work well together and there are solutions found to be able to serve the needs of each side. Could you give us some examples of where you're doing that and where you have done that?
Yeah, I mean, to build on the comments earlier about the 4 new stops on Metro North in the Bronx, that's going to be transformational for that part of the city. From an equity point of view, getting people on a one-stop ride to jobs in Central Business District, but also creating enormous opportunity for new housing. The mayor just announced a a rezoning near the Morris Park stop that'll result in 6,000 new units of housing, desperately needed. Speaks to your point about transit-oriented development, but there are also job clusters there. One of the interesting things that's come out of COVID is our commercial hubs in the outer boroughs have done much better, frankly, than Midtown and downtown. We're going to be addressing some of that later this week with the mayor and the governor making a set of announcements about conversion of office space. But there is an opportunity around Morris Park from a innovation sector point of view. So what do I mean there? You've got Jacoby, you've got Montefiore, you've got a number of hospitals. There's a real opportunity to build on what is an emerging cluster around biotech and really grow that up and create jobs, not just for people walking to work in the neighborhood, but people coming from Westchester, links to manufacturing and biotech in Westchester, and also people getting to those jobs that are coming out of the core up to the Bronx for that work. So absolutely great.
Yeah, what a lot of people don't realize about the 4 stations in the Bronx. Number one, New Haven line is the most heavily traveled commuter rail line in the country. This is going to, and for years, I mean, the Metro North trains didn't come that way. They came through the other way and came into Grand Central. But they have the ability, like the Amtrak trains, to come through there. So instead of trains just whizzing by, they can actually stop, and it's bi-directional. You can have a reverse peak commute. You can go to actually stations along the New Haven line going west of the city, going east of the city. So these are important investments that need to be made. You talked about accessibility, and you know, every once in a while I drop in some trivia. So there's major systems in the world that argue with who's the biggest, who's the best. There's a number of systems that, you know, carry the most people. There's a number of systems that have the most rolling stock or employees. There's only one system in the world that has 474 stations. That's New York City Transit, okay? And that New York City Transit means 71% of the population lives within a half mile of a subway station. So, and that's a tremendous asset. And as the population ages and people get to be older, and they will need to have access to healthcare networks, that transportation system is going to become that much more important. And not everybody's going to be able to afford, nor can they reach and sustain individual Uber rides for everybody or unique rides for everybody to these facilities. So the accessibility one is a big challenge, and it's extremely expensive to do, and it needs to be done. Therese, could you elaborate a little bit more on the issue of your commitment in terms of the social side, in terms of, you've given some examples on different projects you're addressing needs from transportation, but infrastructure at large, where you may be able to do that as well.
So I think the accessibility issue and the equity issue are so important in so many different ways. And I think part of the funding opportunity that we have is to not only just look at things with those lenses, but also look with a goal towards our climate and how that's also impacting how we look at it. So it's great to hear our colleague here from Massachusetts talk about transit-oriented development. But when we look at transit writ large, as you said, New York has nothing but opportunity here, given the breadth and depth of our transit system. But there's also other ways that we can be looking at things. So I'll let the transit experts talk about a little bit more of the transit, but other than to say, from New York State DOT side, we're also working to make sure that rural upstate New York has that level of transit accessibility. And we have to have that flexibility built into it. One of the things that we're talking actively to the transit systems upstate about is the flexibility of that service and the demand, because not everything is a 40-foot bus, right? How do we make sure that we're providing some on-demand services, micromobility, et cetera? And it's really paying off upstate with some of the systems there. But we also need to look at the sustainability pieces. And one of the things that I just want to touch on really quickly is, with the passage of the Environmental Bond Act here in New York State, we've got additional monies to leverage. So in creating resiliency and looking at how do we actually fundamentally meet our climate goals, we've got yet another. So you talked about the IRA, the IIJA, and now we're going to have coming online additional dollars at the state level from the Bond Act. And there's a discussion going on right now how it's actually going to be spent, et cetera. But from DOT's perspective, one of the areas that we're fundamentally working with a number of the state agencies on is looking at building that resiliency through culvert work and bridge work. And we know that if we're able to do that, there's never enough money for bridges, right? It takes a lot of money to rehab a bridge. As you pointed out, most of our bridge infrastructure was last rehabbed in the state in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of the assets are coming due for work. At the same time, New York City, Long Island, the Hudson Valley, we've got a lot of environmental areas where we've got drainage issues, and we need to build in that level of resiliency given the extreme weather that we're seeing. So culverts become very, very important. They're expensive projects, but they pay dividends. So one of the things that New York State DOT is looking at is how do we actually make sure that we're partnering with local governments to deliver on our Bridge New York program. And our Bridge New York program, for those that don't know, is a pretty robust, it's always been a competitive process. Communities from across the state can apply for bridge funding, et cetera. But now we're looking at how do we streamline that? How do we make the bridge program become more of an integral part of the local process through, and what the change that we made here is going through local planning. So letting it be part of the MPO process for those communities that are large enough for the MPO process, but allowing that level of partnership with the localities and in particular counties to help identify literally the assets that need to be addressed most significantly, right, based on condition. And the reason I'm kind of going down this rabbit hole is because it all goes back to the level of investment that we have right now and making sure that we're taking care of those critical assets that really need to be addressed to make sure that our connectivity remains robust, that we're addressing our climate goals as best we possibly can, and meeting the goals, because they're very aggressive in New York State. CLCPA goals for reduction of greenhouse gas are enormous. So whether you're talking about the transit side, taking cars off roads through transit-oriented development and other things, or fundamentally looking at how do we build back resiliency into our infrastructure, these are the types of projects that we're focused on.
Andrew, if there's one thing that I've been amazed at in my time living in New York is the constant changeover of the development world and the anticipation of change that's going to occur, investments that's made, but enables it to grow. But it's hard for me to imagine a more difficult place to be in than the development world right now and in your job, because we're coming off a pandemic. We've got all kinds of different issues. The workforce is changing. I'm a boomer, X and Y's are totally different. I can't even have conversations with my son and my daughter that are on different planets. I'm on a different planet from them. They're on a different planet from me. But what do you anticipate in terms of, we know the workforce is going to change to a certain degree, but what opportunities and how can we help as infrastructure providers and funders and deliverers to be able to make that road better traveled?
Certainly, having the having inflation and the interest rate environment stabilize is absolutely critical. On the building front, I am glass half full that in 2023 we're going to start to see that. If you look at the city's overall recovery, we're going to hit same number of jobs we had pre-pandemic in the next year. So we are fully back. We continue to add jobs as a metro area faster than any other metro area in the United States. So I feel good there. If you look at our office product as an example for Class A trophy, it is doing very well. One of the reasons I'm very optimistic about Penn Station surrounding areas, commercial development getting built over time. Now, that's going to create other opportunities with Class B and C buildings that probably need to be converted to residential in the coming years. So that's sort of on the traditional developer investment side. I would say some out of the box things that have emerged in recent years are an industry like offshore wind, where billions of dollars are being spent now facilitated in part by the federal government leasing water offshore, in part by the state's leadership around putting power purchase agreements out. The city is really trying to capitalize on that opportunity and develop port infrastructure. There's billions of dollars are being spent there. First in South Brooklyn, we just announced a site on the west shore of Staten Island where, knock on something, we think there's a real opportunity to bring a large-scale manufacturing facility in the next couple of years. So real opportunity there. Finally, I would say, looking out in the future around resiliency and climate change, one of the biggest projects for us is Lower Manhattan coastal resiliency, where if we don't do anything by 2050, there's going to be literally 5 feet of water on Water Street. And we are in preliminary design work now to build a series of marshes out from the coastline that will have resiliency barriers within it. You can't really build the barriers along the coast because there are 14 different train lines right underneath. We think that's a tremendous opportunity, probably in the $5 to $10 billion range. I don't know if it'll be ready for IIJA, but maybe the next iteration.
We can't possibly cover all the topics that would be interesting to you and we would like to be able to share with you because we need to move on with the agenda. If you've got any questions for any of the panelists, you can catch them outside, after the session. And there's a couple of topics we didn't even address, but the one also is electrification, because everybody has committed to, I make this speech kind of religiously. A lot of people are committing to a 2035 goal of carbon neutral. I can tell you on the transportation side, the ability to replace fleets is in question. The ability to generate enough power and wheel it down here is in question. And there's no doubt we're going to get to full electrification on some of these things, but not necessarily in those timeframes. And these agencies are going to have to be part of the delivering of those. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time today, and the panelists did an excellent job.